Hello everybody and welcome to Grey History. Today it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr Marisa Linton. A leading expert on the terror, Dr Linton has conducted groundbreaking research on how friendship and the politics of virtue shaped the revolution's most controversial era. As such, this interview will dive into how men who attended each other's weddings and once praised each other's characters could so vigorously denounce and condemn those they previously called friends. We'll start this conversation by exploring the importance of virtue in revolutionary politics before unpacking the fall of the Girondins and the criticality of friendship in the development of the terror. Now, although this is her first live appearance on the podcast, I do quote Dr. Linton regularly. A fan favourite of many community members, I've put links to her recent work in the show notes for those that are interested. I would particularly recommend Choosing Terror, Virtue, Friendship and Authenticity in the French Revolution, as well as Dr. Linton's work with historian Michel Biard, titled Terror, the French Revolution and its Demons. Yet, before we get into it, a very quick reminder that I need your help. It's the friends of the show keeping this podcast off the scaffold, and you can do your part by joining the Grey History community. Indulge in ad-free listening and explore a humongous amount of exclusive bonus content, all while doing your part to create history that isn't black and white. I could really use your assistance, and with the new monthly and annual membership options, as well as a 7-day free trial, it's never been easier to sponsor your favourite French Revolution podcast. So please follow the links in the show notes, on the website, or Google Grey History Patreon. I look forward to welcoming you personally. Dr. Marisa Linton, welcome to Grey History. Thank you so much for making the time.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Perfect. No, the pleasure's all mine. I know that there's a lot of very eager listeners from all over the world that are enthusiastically waiting for this interview. One of the topics that you've written about extensively is the role of virtue in the revolutionary era and in revolutionary politics. And I think that this idea of virtue can be a little surprising and puzzling to the average person in the 21st century. I mean, I can't tell you, well, I don't think I've ever described a politician as virtuous. I've never heard a politician describe themselves as virtuous. And yet this was the norm in revolutionary France. So perhaps to start us off, are you able to outline what is virtue in the context of the revolution's political culture and just why it was so important for us to understand?
Virtue is a key word in 18th century political culture. It had many different meanings, but in that particular context of politics, it means someone who will selflessly devote themselves to the public good without thinking of their own advantage or furthering their own ambition. So someone who is entirely dedicated to helping people. We don't use that term virtue much, but you may often hear a politician talking about their integrity or their honesty or how they want to make a positive difference. And those things are all about their virtue. They may not use the term, but that is what they mean. So it's still something that's very present in our own lives. I think that we're all a bit more cynical about politics now because we've had over 200 years of developing that public dimension of politics, and we've seen many politicians tell outright lies. We are used to it, we expect it, we're all quite cynical. But in the late 18th century in France, this was a new idea and they were much less cynical about it. They didn't have that experience. So they talked very much about the importance of a man, it was usually a man, being virtuous.
And you mentioned that this is a relatively new idea. These concepts around virtue, are they something that, was born with the revolution, that was created within the revolutionary era, or do these ideas predate 1789 in any way?
The idea of being virtuous in politics predates the revolution by a long way. It's just that they hadn't put it into practice. That's what makes the difference. It comes up through the classical Republican tradition. So through their reading of classical authors, the Greeks, the Romans, men who have a certain level of education are very familiar with this idea of virtue in public life. So they look at the great Roman heroes who are exponents of virtue or exponents of the opposite of virtue, and they see these as models. So it is a familiar concept, but it's not something that they thought that you could easily put into practice in everyday life. And in a sense, the revolution is an experiment in putting some of this into effect. Apart from the classical Republican tradition, there's also a growing idea of natural virtue from about the 1750s onwards, which is very much tied up with certain Enlightenment thinkers, particularly Rousseau, but not just him. And this is the idea that people are naturally virtuous. And to have natural virtue, you don't have to have had a classical education. You don't have to be a man. You just need to have true feeling for your fellows, to care sincerely for your fellow human beings, and to find happiness in helping others. So this was also an idea that was current at the time.
A lot to unpack there, but I suppose to start off with, you mentioned that aspects of these ideals came from classical education. Were they confined just to radical politicians then during the revolutionary era, or would we find, say, more conservative members of the National Assembly, or indeed even, say, ministers in the King's court in the old regime? Would they potentially aspire to be men of virtue as well?
Not so much. The idea of virtue, it's an empowering language. So if you were someone who was on the fringes of politics, this was something you would want to seize hold of. If you're a man who already had some power, then to speak incessantly of your own virtue was something you didn't need to do. And it could be quite a risky thing to do as well, because as we'll see, to claim to be virtuous is something that come around and bite you. So, the people from the sort of the noble class who were more used to having important positions in administration, they were less likely to talk about themselves as loving virtue. But yeah, they were all aware of it. They'd all read about it. It's part of a common political currency, so they know about it, for sure.
And you mentioned that there was dangers in explicitly claiming that you were a man of virtue. So how would one demonstrate their virtue? Or perhaps put another way, let's say I was a member of the Jacobin Club and I was watching two deputies that were claiming to be men of virtue. What am I looking for in the way that they act or they behave, or perhaps even the way that they speak or dress?
How you spoke is really important. Revolutionary politics is very much about how you present yourself in public life. So you would be looking for what they say. You can't claim to be a man of virtue yourself, because that sounds devious and suspicious. So you can't say, I am always virtuous. You can say, I love virtue. I want to be virtuous. I aspire to virtue. To claim the high moral ground sounds immediately to our ears, sounds a little bit suspect. So they could say that they love virtue. But the trouble is, everybody might say this. So how do you distinguish the authentically good man from one who just talks the talk, as it were? So other things come into play, and this happens more and more because they become more suspicious of people presenting themselves as being politicians devoted to the public good. How you live your life starts to become more important. If you're living in a palace and you have a lot of finery and servants and carriages, this doesn't look so virtuous. This may look like you're on the take. These are things that you perhaps would want to keep more in the background. How you dress becomes significant, because if you're a very showy dresser, in the style of the Ancien Regime court at Versailles, they were very showy dressers at Versailles before the revolution. If you dress like that, then it seems as though you're spending a lot of money on your outward appearances and your clothes. Other things become more dubious over time as well. So if you're eating in fancy restaurants and spending a lot of money on food, this again indicates that you've got money swilling around, and that you're perhaps somebody who's more grasping and on the take than someone who has real integrity. A lot of it is about sort of cultivating a manner rather than outright obvious indications of what's in a man's heart, because the important thing is to establish what people really feel in their hearts. And that, of course, how can you do that? It's a problem. It's a problem for the revolutionaries. It's a problem for anybody watching a politician. What do they really think? What are they really about?
And is this perhaps some of the issues that we have with the idolization of virtue, the clash where ideas meet practicality? How do you know what's in someone's heart truly? You mentioned that virtue was about the public good, kind of repudiating self-interest. But you could argue that self-interest was natural. The old regime had plenty of corruption, so there's a historical culture there for French politics. Are the revolutionaries almost setting themselves up for failure, or at least for some significant difficulties, by being so fixated on virtue?
I think in retrospect, yes, we would say that. But you have to understand what they're reacting against. So you mentioned the Ancien Regime. They are men of the Ancien Regime. That's where they've come from. That's what they've known. And for their entire lives prior to the revolution, politics, insofar as it exists, politics is the business of the king and his ministers, is about venality. The old regime is built on institutionalized corruption. People buy posts, they buy positions. You cannot advance in the Ancien Regime if you're not venal. That is how it works. So they're reacting against that. So it becomes very important to be about something different. The revolutionaries want to be against the corruption of the Ancien Regime. They are revolutionaries and they don't want that anymore. This is the way in which they position themselves. And I think that's very understandable, but it also does become very problematic in certain circumstances because it's hard to maintain. And they're certainly very aware of that. The philosopher Montesquieu had a lot to say about virtue. Famously, in his book, The Persian Letters, wrote a story about the troglodytes, a short story about the troglodytes. And the troglodytes, this little simple community of people who want to be virtuous, but they decide after a while it's too difficult because every citizen has to work so hard, every citizen has to have an education. It can be hard to breathe up there as a virtuous citizen. It's hard work. It's hard to maintain. So in the end, they ask the oldest troglodyte if he'll take over the job and be king, basically be an autocrat, because they can't do it anymore. And he weeps for the troglodytes because they can't maintain their virtue. I think it's a really, really interesting, quite sad story in a way, but it says something about human nature, certainly that Montesquieu, who's very much a supporter of the nobility, recognizes. He thinks virtue is the highest ideal, but it's unsustainable.
And I suppose the parallels there, just for the benefit of our audience, Montesquieu was writing before the revolution, so he does not have the benefit of hindsight and those kind of connections that some might draw to, say, the Napoleonic era, which follows the Republic. They're not known to him in writing that.
He wrote Persian Letters in, 1721, I think it was, a long time before the revolution, yes.
You mentioned already that you have this issue of people positioning themselves to be men of virtue, and that some might have this authentic desire to help advance the public good. But of course, it doesn't take long for people to realize that there are some very real-world benefits to positioning yourself and stylizing yourself as a man of virtue, even if your true motivations were anything but. Are you able to talk about some of the strategies that one might use to try to advance their career using this sort of language and positioning? I mean, you mentioned in your book, Choosing Terror, in order to be worthy of political office, one had to appear not to want it. How does that work? Because I suppose, to take a step back, we expect our politicians to want their political office. We expect them to have an answer for why they want to be president. And as you say, maybe we want that answer to be slightly about advancing the public good and be relatively selfless, but we still do expect that they want that office. If we go back to the French Revolution, where people couldn't explicitly say that, how would one try to position themselves or use the language of virtue to advance their career?
It's a very difficult thing. And this is a decision that's taken right at the beginning of the revolution, before they know there will be a revolution, that you can't put yourself forward for a candidacy. You can't say, hey, look at me. I'm a person of virtue. Vote for me. You can't say it. You can't propose yourself. You can't officially propose yourself for the Estates General or the successive assemblies. Obviously, they don't know what will happen with that. But this is something they decided on. They, I think up until 1797, they have a brief experiment with men being able to put themselves forward for a candidacy to sit in one of the assemblies. But it doesn't last very long. So from the outset, you can't do it. You can't say it. So they have to devise all these strategies and different ways of signaling, yeah, I'm up for it. I want to stand. I want to be in politics, but they have to find a way of doing it. People write things. Lots of people write pamphlets, or they position themselves in the various clubs that are set up, the openings that become available for active revolutionaries to have a voice, to have a say. And those men who are good speakers in the clubs and then in the assemblies may further their careers through that means. So it's very much about how you present yourself, but then also how you back that up and what your fellow revolutionaries think of you. So there's a constant jostling going on for how you are presented. But it becomes very hard. In the end, how can anyone prove that he's a man of virtue? You mentioned my book, Choosing Terror. In the final chapter of that, I talk about the problem of really establishing that you're virtuous, as opposed to coming out with a glib line. And the only way really to prove it ultimately was to be prepared to die for your beliefs. And many of them do die. And there's this huge trauma for some of the men and a few women who ultimately go to the guillotine for their political beliefs in the year 2. And they talk about that. They talk about how posterity will vindicate them as only ever having wanted the public good.
I suppose the irony there is that a few hundred years on, and we as posterity have some very divided opinions about who has been vindicated and who has not been. I suppose, you just alluded to the fact that as these aspects of a political culture so fixated on virtue, it has consequences, some positive, some negative. Are you able to maybe present a broader outline about what are some of the long-term consequences of virtue being so central to revolutionary politics?
Well, in the longer term, it becomes untenable, particularly after the fall of Robespierre. It becomes something they talk about less. And after the period of time that we refer to, I think falsely, as the terror, this is something that they do become very cautious about. Boissy d'Anglas, 1795, said, we've lived 6 centuries in 6 years. So the experience of revolution had exhausted them and shown them how hard it was to live up to these ideals. And they've become much more cautious about it. But the other thing you have to bear in mind, this notion of the virtuous politician is not operating in some vacuum. All the time, from April 1792 onwards, there is a war that is being fought on many fronts and even within France at points. And in the context of war, these things become very, very difficult. And after the fall of the Jacobins from power, with the fall of Robespierre, there's a much more overt grasping for position again, an advancement, and much less talk of virtue. One of the things that the ongoing war opens up is potential for openings of people who are corrupt. So, for example, people who want to supply the armies with essentials like coats and boots and horses and everything the army needs and weapons. If you can get one of those contracts, you can make a lot of money. And really, you don't want to be talking about virtue or having other people talking a lot about virtue very much. If for you, the revolution has been a means to advancement, that is essentially what a lot of it becomes after that high point of the Jacobin Republic.
Another way that the language of virtue could be used for advancement was, I suppose, attacks on political opponents. And we see this very early on in the Jacobin Club, long before even the factional disputes of the Mountain versus the Girondins. Are you able to elaborate on just how this language and concept of virtue was weaponized against political opponents?
It does become something that's weaponized, particularly when it's connected to other things like conspiracy, fear of conspiracy. So what is the opposite of a man of virtue? He's a duplicitous man, a conspirator, someone who is secretly working to further his own ambitions and working against the Republic. And that is a big fear that they have, a growing fear from the moment that the war is declared onwards. That becomes a bigger and bigger thing, particularly after the fall of the monarchy. And to be seen as a conspirator against the Republic is a really, really dangerous thing. And that's the sort of language that they use in the various trials that they have of revolutionary politicians who are accused of treason against the Republic and being the opposite of men of virtue, being corrupt, of having sold themselves and sold out the revolution.
And I suppose to go back to your point earlier about authenticity, that's one of the fundamental issues that you have, is who can you trust, who is being authentically virtuous and who is just talking the talk because it's politically advantageous. Another topic that you've written about extensively is that of friendship, and I suppose this ties into these ideas about who may or may not be acting with authentic virtue. Are you able to talk about the role of friendship in the Terror and how important it is for us to kind of understand these events?
Friendship, again, it's a really important idea for the revolutionaries. It was important also in the Ancien Regime, the idea of friendship, because every culture has its friendships, every society. But in the Ancien Regime, friendship, at least in that realm of public administration, tended to be more vertical. It's more about patronage and clientage and who will do you a favour. So if you can call someone a friend, perhaps they will help you or they will help them. It becomes politics as leverage, really. And that's an accepted thing. When the revolution takes place, because they're rejecting the Ancien Regime, that kind of friendship, getting a helping hand, becomes much more suspect. Because why do you want someone to help you? You know, what is going on there? And yet at the same time, the revolutionaries idealize friendship. They've all read their Rousseau. They're all very into the idea of true emotion, true feeling. So that there's an idealization of friendship as a kind of connection, but there's also some ambiguity about it. In practical terms, the revolutionaries tend to make a lot of friendships very quickly because a revolution is a fast-moving thing. You're working together in a moment of danger and crisis, all for the same goal, at least initially. And there are a lot of friendships that are formed in that white-hot culture of revolution. And it seems to be breaking down a lot of the rigid social barriers of the Ancien Regime. So you can become friends with someone who's socially your superior. And that's something they really see as valuable and important thing, a kind of glue that keeps politics together. So on the one hand, there's an idealization of friendship. But then there's also a growing fear of it because by its very nature, friendship is quite private. It's between two people, behind the scenes, behind closed doors. And that links up then with the idea of the Ancien Regime and what's really going on and what's really in people's hearts. So, for an example of this, if as a revolutionary politician, you're prepared to go to someone's house and eat their dinner, a sign of friendship, a sign of you helping one another. But to the minds of outsiders, could this be a sign of conspiracy, a sign that something is going on that the public doesn't know about? Are these men doing a deal? Are they handing one another posts? Are they supporting one another's rise to some position of power? So friendship, it's quite understandable, really becomes something murky when seen from the outside. The revolutionaries have to negotiate this. They both idealize friendship and they become, in certain situations, suspicious of it, where friendship is about other people and they don't really quite know what's going on. Because revolutionary politics is all meant to be in the open. It's meant to be in the assemblies, it's meant to be in the clubs, it's meant to be in your writing, and those things obviously do happen. But also there is downtime when people kind of go to each other's homes and they talk, and the talks are not recorded. So what's happening there? It does become difficult.
It's one of those things that in a revolution that is so obsessed with and defined by this omnipresent beliefs and conspiracies, the issue of these behind closed door politics and this guilt by association is just so prevalent. We've just covered the trial of the Girondins and talked about how their meetings, the opposite of the Jacobins who are debating in public where they can be seen, and this behind closed door politics really comes to bite them. I found it interesting in your book that you wrote about how Saint-Just had written in his private diary that one cannot govern without friendships. But then you can't imagine him saying that during the Terror because there's such a disconnect between private sentiments and public sentiments. One of the other things that you noted was how friendships was instrumental to the downfall of the Girondins. And given the fact that we've just covered their trial, I was wondering if you could unpack that a little bit more in terms of, I suppose, maybe the guilt by association or these connections to conspiracy or corruption.
Absolutely. The trial of the Girondins really showed some awful, awful kind of backstories about friendship. The Girondins themselves had not been averse to accusing others of having secret, duplicitous friendships. So they had certainly done it too. Brissot, for example, had accused Barnave of having, a more moderate revolutionary, of having stuck to friendships that had now become suspect. Barnave's friendship with the Lamette, whom he would not disavow, even when he was put on trial for that. So the Girondins used it too, but then this kind of language of suspicious friendships was used against them in turn. So, for example, Brissot had sent a letter to Madame Roland, wife of the Minister of the Interior at that time, of a list of trusted people for positions. And he said it's always good to have a list like this by you, a sort of handy list to present to the minister. So when he's looking for people to present to paid posts in the administration, here's a list of our people, the people we trust. Now, you could see that as being a practical means of getting things done, or you could see that as corrupt and suspicious, which is certainly how Desmoulins saw it when he attacked Brissot. And yet these men had been friends. When Desmoulins married, he was so involved in revolutionary politics that many revolutionary activists, his friends, came along to the wedding. He says 60 of them came along to the wedding. One of those friends had been Brissot, who was a witness at Desmoulins' wedding. Another friend who was a witness to Desmoulins' wedding was Robespierre. All these men were his friends at one point. But by the time of the fall of the Girondins, Desmoulins was very implicated in attacking Brissot and others. He wrote Brissot Unmasked, which was a notorious pamphlet. So the unmasking claims to show the true, authentic face of Brissot as a man against the revolution. Brissot Unmasked. And a fragment of the secret history of the Girondins, that was also Desmoulins. He had a real facility with words. And yet, when the Girondins were condemned to death, he's supposed to have collapsed in the gallery and said, it's my Brissot unmasked, which is killing them. He recognised that he'd had a hand in what he'd done to attack people who had been his friends, and that he had been a part of this himself. But then it's later used against him too, and it becomes this vicious spiralling. When Desmoulins is defending himself in the Jacobin Club, December 1793, so a little bit after you're at the point you've reached in the podcast, but he's being attacked, he knows. And one of the things he's being attacked for is his friendships with suspicious people. And he says, I was always the first to denounce my own friends. What a thing to say. And as soon as I realized that they weren't genuine men of virtue supporting the Republic, I was prepared to attack my own friends. He says that he would not shake Barnave's hand until after Barnave had been condemned to death. And then as an individual, he could shake Barnave's hand again. I mean, these are terrible, terrible things to say. But Desmoulins is doing it to try and defend himself from this attack that he too has had the wrong friends. It doesn't save him.
No, it doesn't save many of them. It's interesting, this culture of to be so against self-interest and against the ambitions and motives of not only yourself, but your friends and your family and your allies, to create this culture where, as you say, you need to, or it encourages the active denunciation of your peers. But as the story that you just provided around Demoulins' wedding illustrates, so many of these Jacobins were once upon a time friends with one another. In particular, the Girondins and the Mountain, because they had, at least for a period of time, been the most radical of the Jacobin camp during the years of the constitutional monarchy. And I suppose one of the questions that I get often from listeners is, how did people choose between sides? They've got friends and acquaintances in both camps. What were some of the factors that made someone, shift towards the Mountain or shift towards the Girondins? And what role did, say, emotions have in this as well? Because these are very personal decisions with interpersonal relations between these leading revolutionaries.
That's a really good question. It's really hard to give you an answer because this is about what people are actually thinking and thinking, how they feel in their hearts, and they don't necessarily say. Also, in 1793 and 1794, if you're a very active revolutionary politician, saying what you really think can be quite dangerous, particularly when you're talking about friendship. So they may not say it, or they may justify themselves. So it's really hard to judge. It's a really, really good question, and I'm not trying to be kind of evasive about the answer. I struggle with some of that myself. And in the end, yes, one of the ways that you can tell if somebody is a true friend of someone else is if they are willing to risk arrest in defense of that friend at a point at which arrest may also mean indictment, may mean going before the Revolutionary Tribunal, may mean death. That's a big ask of any friend, isn't it? So those things are, I think, very, very hard to evaluate. We do have some instances, and I do talk about them a bit in Choosing Terror, where people come out to the open and they speak about their friends and how they feel about them. But if the friend is already in a bad political light, they know it's risky. So, for example, when the Dantonists were arrested, I know that's going forward from where you've got to, but when they're arrested, that's Georges Danton, Camille Desmoulins, about who I've been speaking, and two other deputies at the same time. One of their friends, Legendre, tries to speak up in the convention to say, this is wrong. You're not meant to arrest deputies unheard in the convention, and then the convention should decree their arrest, not the committees. This is wrong. This is going against procedure. And at that moment, Robespierre intervenes against his former friends, Danton and Desmoulins, and says, we didn't let the Girondins speak in the convention before their arrest. We didn't do that. So why should these men have a particular privilege? The revolution is against privilege. Privilege is Ancien Regime. Everybody has the same law, and they will go before the Revolutionary Tribunal, and they can speak in their defense because we trust in that system of justice. Now, whether or not people genuinely agreed with him, they voted with him. And Legendre himself backed down. He's obviously terrified. He doesn't say it, but he's obviously terrified for his own life. And he says, no, I trust the system. And he backs down. He doesn't want to be arrested and possibly die too. So this is a really hard call, I think, then to decide what people really think.
It's one of those things that, there's a certain irony because we are faced with the same dilemma that many of the revolutionaries faced, where we don't have necessarily a great grasp about inner motivations because, as you say, public statements or private statements could be incriminating at this point in time. To reference events we've just discussed in the podcast, when Amar gives the report from the Committee of General Security, where he essentially significantly increases the list of formal traitors that will be declared for the Girondins, and then proceeds to essentially label dozens more as suspects and detained more. The doors of the convention have been closed. Like, who is going to stand up and say, actually, I have a problem with this, this is not right? You are just going to get yourself on the prescription list. But then likewise, what we was discussing this with members after the fact, come a couple of years later, yes, you get these statements from deputies who survived that says, oh, this was terrible, I was against it, etc. But of course, it's in vogue to say that. You have Jacobins that were at the forefront of some of the extremes of the terror that are trying to actively repudiate their involvement in it. And so we are faced with the same dilemma that contemporaries faced, which is, what are people truly thinking? And as you say, there's only a few things that can really paint that picture, and one of them is if they're willing to go to the scaffold for their friends and for their beliefs.
Yes, I think, yes, you put it very well. I think this is absolutely the case. It's a terrible moment in the convention when Amara is going to read out the indictment. They lock the doors. They physically, as you say, they lock the doors. People can't get out and they don't see it coming. And there's the whole question of a list of men who'd signed a protest against the arrest of the Girondin deputies. And that list is produced and some of the men on that list are then put in prison. Terrible. 75 or over, who just protested against the arrest of a fellow member of the convention. And they are imprisoned for it. And there are some people who want those men sent to the guillotine. Biard is one of them. He wants them sent before the Revolutionary Tribunal. It's Robespierre who stands against that. When Robespierre thinks he can do that, he, without himself being overwhelmed, he does try and defend some people, and he does defend those deputies. He won't have them sent before the Revolutionary Tribunal, and he speaks against doing so. But that was a risky thing for even him to do. He has his credit as, you know, the incorruptible and so forth, but it's still a risky thing for him to do. But they weren't sent before the Revolutionary Tribunal, and later they are released. They weren't grateful to Robespierre. But I think they were all very traumatized. I mean, traumatic to be arrested. And there were so many members of the convention who went through that experience. In talking about the Girondins, you're talking about the start of that process. But in total, 86 deputies of the National Convention were either executed or took their own lives to preempt public execution. A terrible, terrible situation. And nearly a third of the deputies of the convention were arrested at some point. And arrest was terrifying because even if you weren't sent before the Revolutionary Tribunal, you might be, you didn't know, and you could die in prison. I mean, being in prison was in itself quite a risky thing because they were very insanitary and crowded. It was traumatic for many of these people who'd undertaken public life. And the ones who tended to be arrested were the most politically active, the ones who had the highest profile, the ones who people knew, the ones who wouldn't keep their mouths closed. Perhaps the most ambitious, perhaps the most dedicated to the revolution. It certainly includes many Montagnards and former members of the Jacobin Club, including the Girondin deputies, and it's amongst those groups that the attrition rates were the highest. In the whole of the year too, no deputy who was sent before the Revolutionary Tribunal came back alive. After the acquittal of Marat, it changes that whole year. I mean, what price to be a revolutionary politician at that time? Really risky.
It's an incredibly steep price, to say the least. I'm very conscious of time, and thank you so much for your time today. Do you have any closing thoughts or parting words about the importance of virtue and friendship as we continue to explore the terror? Are there anything that you think that listeners should maybe keep in mind as we explore, well, what are some of the grim realities of this period?
I think we have to be open to what is actually happening, not just what people say is happening, but the whole wider context of revolutionary politics. As I said before, you can't forget that there is a war happening while all this is going on. Because people say, what is it specifically about the French Revolution that makes them so vicious towards one another? Yeah, they were vicious at that point, but they hadn't started out like that. They'd started out wanting genuinely liberty, equality, and believing in the rights of man. They didn't set out to be sending a lot of people to the guillotine, including their former friends. So how does that happen? And I think rather than thinking, oh, it's all about Robespierre or they're all in some psychodrama, it's better to understand the bigger context of what is happening and how people are struggling to deal with their own experiences within that context. Because I think if we're honest, it could happen to a lot of us, given the particular circumstances. Robespierre was against the death penalty. I don't know if you've discussed that in your podcast. He wanted it abolished. In May 1791, he stood up in the National Assembly and said, this is barbaric and unjust. I want it abolished. And people said, no, you can't do that. We need a deterrent. And he said, it's not effective. It's not just. It doesn't work. He was overruled, obviously. And they had the death penalty. But he was against it. And yet this is the same man who later supports the trial and execution of the king. He says you have to have this for the Republic to live. And later he supports the arrest and trial and execution of some people who've been friends of his. This is all one man. But to find the answer to why this happened, it's not enough to look at Robespierre's psychology. You've got to look at the other things that are happening, because they're all making very difficult and, I think in retrospect, we would say, well, probably quite unreasonable decisions. But we've not been in those circumstances. And many of them who survived that period struggled to understand themselves really quite what had happened. If you read some of the memoirs of surviving deputies, they'd lived through such a lot.
Just before we wrap up, we did have a few listener questions sent in, and I've sneakily snuck a few of them in already and just, shamelessly claimed them as my own. So not the most virtuous podcasting over here. But one question that was sent in was a question around your favourite fictional interpretation of the French Revolution, whether it be a novel or a film or something else. The listener wanted to know what you thought, a piece of work that you thought caught something essential about the complexity of what happened.
If I had to choose one thing, it would be the film Danton, 1983. It's the film that first started my own interest in the revolution. So I think it has a lot to answer for. And I still think it's a brilliant film. André Weider directed it. You may know that it's from a play written by, I cannot always pronounce her name, the Polish playwright, or I mangle it, sorry to any Polish listeners out there, Stanisława Szybicewska. She wrote the original play, Danton's Case, in Polish, and that was in 1929. It was never performed. It was about 14 hours long, apparently. It would have been, had the whole thing been performed. But she adored Robespierre. She was very, very interested by revolutionary politics, devoted to it. And she has a lot of primary source material in that play, and it really comes across if you've read the transcript of the play itself. Fantastic. What Weider did, though, was he took the 14 hours and turned it into a much shorter film and turned it around, so that from Robespierre and Saint-Just being sort of the heroic centre of the story, Danton and Desmoulins become the heroes. I think very, very interesting. But she's still sympathetic towards Robespierre. The portrayal of Robespierre, I think, is really, really interesting in that film. There are lots of historical inaccuracies. It is a film, folks. So if you watch it, do remember that. I'm not holding up as an example of authentic source material. It's a film, it's entertainment. But it does give you a sense of what it might have been like, and that experience, and how they're all kind of rushing around, improvising and trying to do things from moment to moment. The portrayal of the Committee of Public Safety, deeply flawed, but really, really gripping. It's also very sad, of course. It's all about, will all revolutions fail? That's its that's sort of the behind story. But you could watch that, and then you could watch the Marseillaise, which is from the Popular Front, French Popular Front, which is very pro-revolution and very cheerful and very optimistic. So you get both sides.
We're all about that here at Grey History, a little bit of both sides, and somewhere in between might be the more accurate representation. Dr. Linton, I just wanted to say once again, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and I hope you had a great time.
I did. Thank you very much. Yes, I've enjoyed it. I hope the listeners enjoy it too.
Thank you for listening to this fantastic episode with Dr. Marisa Linton. You can find details of Dr. Linton's work and her social media handles in the show notes for this episode. Personally, I can't recommend enough Choosing Terror, Virtue, Friendship and Authenticity in the French Revolution, which you can order online and in all good bookstores. Of course, before we wrap up, one final reminder that I could really use your help. Friendships might be risky in revolutionary politics, but it's impossible to govern alone. Equally impossible is history podcasting, and it's with the support of listeners of this show that this revolution remains on the air. So if you're enjoying Grey History, please consider supporting the show today. Enjoy ad-free listening, bonus content, and a range of other perks, and help do your part to make history that isn't black and white. There's links in the show notes, on the website, or Google Grey History Patreon. As always, thank you for listening, stay safe, and have a great day.